Hi there. Welcome to episode 1 of every game in my Steam library, in which I play through all 853 games in my Steam library that are still playable, and do a little review of my thoughts on each game. For episode 1, I chose a game that I got almost 10 years ago, and I remember being really excited for, that I never ended up finishing until now. You can probably already guess what it is from the footage on screen, but for those who don't know, this episode is about the game Dishonored, developed by Arcane and published by Bethesda. Let's get started. I think the overall vibe I get from Dishonored is one of high ambitions, but falling just short of execution, mostly for the story. Let's tackle that first, and then I'll talk a bit about the gameplay. Dishonored takes place in a world going through an industrial revolution, using whale oil as fuel for industrial and scientific development. We play as Corvo Attano, the personal bodyguard / assassin of the Empress of a place called Dunwall, and the game starts with the assassination of the Empress, so I guess we're not very good at our job. The Empress's daughter Emily, her successor, was kidnapped during the assassination, and Corvo is framed for the job. Corvo then escapes from prison, meets up with a resistance group, assassinates his way through the assassins, gets betrayed, assassinates his way through his former allies, and then puts Emily on the throne, who is strongly suggested to be Corvo's daughter. My first problem with the game actually starts right at the beginning, and is indicative of the problems throughout. During the intro, you find out that Corvo has returned early from some kind of overseas voyage, making his presence during the Empress's assassination unexpected. Yet, throughout the game, all the characters who set up the assassination act like the whole plan, from the beginning, was to pin it on Corvo and execute him to cement their power and give the people of Dunwall a scapegoat. It is literally never mentioned outside of a single throwaway line in the intro that Corvo wasn't even supposed to be around during the assassination. So what was the original plan? Were they hoping to write up some propaganda to imply that Corvo secretly came back, assassinated the Empress, left again, and then showed up a few days later like nothing was wrong? The setup works just fine without that information. Just remove that dialogue about him being an unexpected appearance. Why is it there? This leads me to my main gripe with the story in general, which is that player choice is supposed to affect how the game world reacts in later levels, but you're punished for putting yourself in the shoes of the actual character of Corvo Attano. One of the main marketing shticks for this game when it was being released was that the amount of violence that you introduce into the world will be reflected by the world back at you. Essentially, if you assassinate people instead of sneaking past them or knocking them out, more and harder enemies will appear later in the game, and your allies will be mean to you, because you're also a big meanie, I guess. The problem is that this makes no sense in the context of the character. Corvo is a bodyguard and an assassin. His job is literally to kill people, mostly political enemies, and then everyone acts shocked and offended when you start killing political enemies. For my playthrough, I roleplayed as the Empress's assassin, and by the end of the game, my personal ferry driver, Samuel, was basically wishing death on me. What did people think would happen when they killed the Empress? That her personal assassin wouldn't go on a throat-slitting spree to assure the survival of her heir, especially with the implicit support of a rival political group? In the final mission, the ferry driver Samuel basically tells you to fuck off, and he's going to let everyone know you're coming. In other words, if you want to retain the element of surprise and remain the sneaky boy that you've been up to this point in the story, you have to immediately turn around and kill the guy who saved your life in the second act. The game acts like everything is your fault, and that your actions set the story in motion, not the actions of an unrelated, power-hungry despot to which you are reacting. I think the overall game suffers for the attempt at player freedom. The experience would be tighter and more compelling if we were allowed to indulge in the power fantasy of an assassin who has been wronged by a corrupt system and surrounded by characters who understood that. Speaking of characters who understand things, let's talk about the betrayal and the final two missions first. The betrayal is completely predictable, but not necessarily bad. It's fairly obvious from the beginning that Pendleton, Havelock, and Martin are essentially using you to clear out their competition and consolidate power for themselves. The game wants you to think of them first as your allies, and then as political masterminds using you as a pawn. The problem is that immediately afterwards, during the final mission, they're all nearly blackout drunk and screaming at each other about what to do about you, Emily, and how each of the others fucking sucks as you slowly make your way into their fortress to inevitably slit their throats as well. The change from political masterminds to infighting idiots happened so quickly that it gave me whiplash. The only character who seems to understand what kind of world they are in is Granny Rags. If you know, you know. This weird attitude of the game towards Corvo and his actions is evident in the ending cutscene, and to be fair, this cutscene's contents also depends on your chaos level. In other words, how many people you killed. For my playthrough role-playing as the Empress's assassin, the character that the story establishes you as, the ending cutscene essentially scolds the player for killing the new Empress's political enemies and calls you a bad boy for putting her on the throne in an age of blood, or something. I don't remember the exact quote. I watched the good ending cutscene on YouTube to get a sense of how the story plays out if you have low chaos, and apparently not killing a bunch of corrupt guards and politicians who plotted to kill a bunch of other guards and politicians somehow ushers in a golden age. From the verbiage of the ending cutscene, I'm assuming that it mostly depends on how your actions affect Emily. But the problem is that you spend a total of about 10 minutes around her during the entire course of the game. She spends most of her time being kidnapped. She doesn't accompany you on your missions, learning how you do what you do. The first inkling of this happens in the Resistance headquarters after the first time you save her, and in my playthrough, she's drawing a picture of Corvo as a black shadow, killing a bunch of people, to which my personal reaction was to want to turn around to the rest of the Resistance and go, "You guys are telling her about this stuff? You know she's like 6, right?" It seems like our actions as Corvo affect things that should be reasonably almost totally out of our control, while not doing much at all to those who our actions directly affect, specifically a character named Slackjaw and his street gang. Throughout the story, there is a street gang who will occasionally help or fight you depending on the context, but the context seems to be rolling a pair of dice. Directly after a mission where I killed a bunch of his gang and poisoned their still, they invited me into their headquarters to speak with their leader, Slackjaw, who basically asks me to do some busy work for him in classic video game style. After being nice and doing this busy work for the gang, in the next mission they were all hostile and tried to kill me on sight. They continue to act like this until my final interaction with Slackjaw, wherein he acts all buddy-buddy with me, trying to convince me to kill the one character that actually makes sense. It just doesn't seem like Corvo's relationships with the characters in the game reflect his actions in any meaningful way. It seems more like if you kill people, the game gets harder, and then it calls you a dick and tells you that you suck at the end, and if you don't, then everyone lives happily ever after, including those who were plotting against you literally a week ago. There's no nuance to it at all, which is a damn shame, because the concept is there, and the game is short enough that if your actions had some sensible weight to them, I would be compelled to play it through a few different times to see what else my actions affect. So how could we fix this? Well, I think that if you are particularly vicious during the first act, the Resistance doesn't betray you, rethinks their plan, and you end up with a morally gray ending in which power is restored to Emily, but with an uneasy alliance with the aristocracy based on the threat of violence. If you don't kill anyone, you get an ending where everyone wakes up after you've knocked them out, something that the game seems to forget is possible. You're ambushed in the throne room by everyone else, who has teamed up to take you and Emily out, and they pop some caps on the two of you and take over Dunwall, either inciting a civil war or some kind of dictatorship. And a third ending where if you ride the knife edge between the two gameplay styles, you take out enough of the power players from the two opposing political parties that they can't organize, and you restore peace and stability with Emily on the throne, and the remaining living insurrectionists in the brig, so to speak. I think each of these endings makes more sense in the context of the world and the characters, and are also far more interesting and stem directly from the consequences of your actions as Corvo. All that said, let's move on to the game part of the video game and talk about how it actually plays. The idea of player choice also rears its head here, but in a more sensible and thought out way, in my opinion. The game's levels are large and open-ended, with plenty of routes, secrets, power-ups, coins, and interesting NPC interactions. To traverse these levels, you have a couple of choices. Your main workhorse for most of the game is a skill called Blink, which carries the gameplay if I'm being honest. Blink allows you to teleport to a close-by location instantly in any direction, allowing you to climb up to roofs by blinking up balconies, move around guard patrols without raising alarms, move from shadow to shadow while tracking a mark, and generally engage in a certain freedom of movement not often seen in a first-person or stealth game. Honestly, I could recommend this game based on this feature alone. A far second is a skill called Possession, which allows you to possess rats and run through tunnels or around guards who might try to stomp you, but you can outrun them pretty quickly. These two skills really open up the world to you and allow you to move around as you please, and the levels seem to be designed with this movement in mind, making for a very compelling minute-to-minute experience. Likewise, assassinations are very satisfying, and the game allows you to approach them in any way you please, as long as the target is dead or knocked out by the end of the process. I also actually quite enjoy the head-on combat, although it is a little held back by the fact that you're usually hot-swapping your skills and weapons to move around the battlefield and take out enemies quickly, as you are a bit of a glass cannon, and this process can kind of get in the way of the flow of things. I often gave up and reloaded a save or let the enemies kill me when I got spotted by a group, as I didn't feel like going through the head-on combat process with multiple enemies. Although there were some instances where I felt like a badass, cutting down enemies while blinking all over the place. Honestly, my only problem with the combat and gameplay in general was the ability Dark Sight. This ability consumes very little mana and allows you to see enemies through walls and see what their sight cones are as well. I ended up spending a majority of my time in the stealthier bits with a yellow and indigo filter over the screen that highlighted my enemies. Considering the very low mana consumption of the skill, I basically always knew where enemies were and never felt like I was at risk of being surprised, which fits the characterization of Corvo, so I'm not really complaining about that, but I wish they had just turned the skill into a passive that gives you a very basic minimap and shows the general direction of enemies in relation to you in the corner of the screen, and remove the Dark Sight ability entirely. This still gives you the awareness of your surroundings, but also introduces a little more ambiguity to it, heightening the tensity of each encounter a little bit. Honestly, that's all I really have to say about the actual gameplay. It's a really solid core gameplay loop and very compelling when playing. I would definitely recommend Dishonored if you like solid stealth games and open-ended movement mechanics. The story's a bit all over the place, but can be ignored if you just want to play a game where you sneak around and slit some throats. But if you're playing for the story, prepare to be let down a bit. If it sounds like an interesting time, I would encourage you to pick it up. If you've played Dishonored, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, this has been every game in my Steam library.